The U.S. Department of Justice states, the link between academic failure and delinquency, violence, and crime is welded in reading failure. The national reading crisis is much more than poor grades and missing assignments. And for Black children, their legacy with literacy dates back to slavery. My guest today is Resha Conroy. She is a speech and language pathologist, the founder of the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, and the mother of 2 children with learning differences, including a son with dyslexia. You have to hear her story. Let's begin.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hi, Resha. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm so glad you're here too. And what's so interesting is that we haven't met in real life. We've only kind of met virtually. And I attended a virtual event. I'm trying to remember where I first saw you, because I've seen a couple of your YouTube videos. But I think the first time I saw you was at a virtual event that you did on literacy, a social justice issue, and you were one of the speakers.
Right, with Learning Ally. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And after hearing you speak, I knew I wanted to have a conversation with you. So I think I probably reached out to you soon after that. And it was just a great conversation about the work that you're doing. And I just felt like there was a lot of similarities in kind of the passion that we have for the work that we're doing. And for our listeners who may not know who you are, you're the founding member of the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children. And we're going to talk about that. And you've been very open about the fact that your son has dyslexia.
Correct.
And I would love for you to kind of maybe even just start by talking about your experience with identifying his language-based reading disorder, because it feels like that's shaped your journey a bit in terms of where you are right now.
Absolutely. So that definitely is what brought me to the dyslexia space. I'll talk a little bit about my background, because I worked in education reform. So it was almost like connecting dots and then having this sort of more personal connection. So my son was diagnosed, and I always put that in quotes because it wasn't official. The use of the word dyslexia is not something that's very common when you're in a school setting. So he was diagnosed in first grade, and, I started to see signs that something was different about the way he was, acquiring reading. And he was a child who had a delay with language. So he had previously received speech language services from about the time of 3 until starting school. And when he got to kindergarten, he just, he wasn't learning to read. He wasn't retaining knowledge from like one page to the next or from one week to the next. And so I, was paying attention to that. And then the teacher came to me and said, it seems like he's stuttering, or he's having, some sort of issue in class when he's answering questions. And I said, well, I don't think it's a stuttering issue. He had a language delay. He's always kind of had issues with word finding. And so I had already started to do some of my research because, like I said, I was seeing the signs there. And word finding is one of the characteristics that's very common with dyslexia. And so I said, you know what, let's not wait. Let's go ahead and do an evaluation now. So you probably know that if a child has a history of a language delay, that there's a higher likelihood that the child will have dyslexia or another language-based reading disorder. So we went, right. So this is kindergarten, and we went ahead and we did the evaluation. And kindergarten is a tricky time in a school building because it's hard to get a diagnosis of dyslexia to begin with, whatever grade you're in. But in kindergarten, it's, they don't really want to do the evaluation, but they did it, and they denied him services. They said, no, he doesn't qualify for anything. So my son is not just a little bit dyslexic. He's extremely dyslexic, and we're learning more as we go. So when I say they denied him services, I'm talking about a child who really was not reading. who was entering first grade. And so at that point, I decided to get an independent evaluation. And so this is where, you start to see the disparities start to creep in. And so although I'm not rich, I have access to, just being in education, access to resources and ways to figure things out, to pull things together. So I got the independent evaluation, and his decoding skills were in the first percentile. So when I say he was severely dyslexic, I mean that, but yet he was denied services in the school building. So in September, when first grade started, I, requested that we reconvene, and we did. And they were prepared to deny him services again. And what allowed him to get services was the speech language pathologist in the building. And so, I told her, I did this independent evaluation, and I'm thinking of doing a speech evaluation as well. And she said, I'll see him again. Let me sit with him for a bit. And, I'll do something informal and see what's going on. So she did. And after, she said, I don't know if he'll qualify in other areas, but I'm going to qualify him just based on what I'm seeing with speech. And so that's what got him in the door to receive any type of services. And so at that point, he was getting resource room and he was getting speech. And his progress was slow. And so I don't want to completely blame the school in terms of his progress, because like I said, he is severely dyslexic. But there were other things that started to happen as well, because dyslexia doesn't happen in sort of a vacuum. It happens with other things that occur with it. So my son has ADHD. You're going to see issues with reading, but you're also going to see issues with pragmatic language. It's going to show up across the day. And so we started to experience some of that as well. But I also started to hear things that wasn't just about his reading. It was about who he was as a person and as a student, and as a Black child sitting in a classroom. And at the time, he was he was the only Black child in his class, because we had moved to a community where that's what the demographics looked like. And so I heard things like, well, it's okay that he's on the low end of reading. And, when I share that with people, I tell them, I was in a high performing school district where the expectations weren't low for children. They were very high, but for whatever reason, I was supposed to be okay with him being on this low end. And, he took a non-reading test, and he scored very high on it. And the school psychologist turned to me and said, "Wow, are you surprised your son is so smart?" So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah. Am I surprised?
Are you surprised?
Right. And I wasn't surprised, but they were surprised. And that is speaking to something that we know is really important when it comes to achievement for students: teacher expectations.
Right. And there's so many layers to the story. And the unfortunate thing is that you're not alone in this experience. There's, in many cases, not all, thank goodness, there is a delay in getting kids the appropriate support and the appropriate intervention. So to hear that you were denied services when your son is high performing in some areas, but below the first percentile in reading, that's a huge red flag, particularly when you have that risk factor of a speech and language delay. But I'm thinking to myself as you're describing this story is that you have the background and the knowledge being in education to know what you need to do to kind of move forward and get your son services. But there are many families who don't have those resources at their disposal, and who might be, take what the teachers and educators say, that your child doesn't really need it right now. It's too early. He's only in kindergarten, or there might be low expectations. And so I think that's something that is striking to me, is that you are kind of stand out in your persistence of figuring out what you need to do to support your son.
And that brings me to the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, and, why I founded it, because my experiences are not unique to me. And so, of course, if you speak to any family, regardless of race or socioeconomic status or whatever else, and they have a child who has dyslexia, they're going to hear a lot of the things that I heard, like, oh, well, wait, or, if the child is really young, or it's too soon, or whatever other excuse that you're going to hear within a school building that delays identifying the child, delays intervention, those types of things. But for Black families, you start to hear language that has to do with race, has to do with racism, that has to do with, implicit biases. And those things impact your access to an evaluation and to an intervention. But it also may impact what your child eventually gets diagnosed with. And so if you have a child who is in first grade, second grade, and they're not reading, by the time they get to third grade, that language-based reading disorder may morph into something that looks like a behavioral issue. And while we don't have a lot of Black children who are diagnosed with dyslexia, we have a lot of Black children that are diagnosed with behavioral issues. And they may coexist, but if you haven't identified part of what is the root issue, then you're not going to be able to do anything to address the behavioral issues, because it's not just a behavioral issue. There's a child who is in a classroom where you have to be able to read in order to access the curriculum, and they're not doing it. So what are they going to do? They're going to act out, or they're going to act in. And I say act in, I mean, maybe they'll withdraw, maybe they'll feel anxiety, so school refusal, all of those types of things. And then we know that when Black children do have quote unquote behavior issues in school, the consequences for them are much harsher. So, there's lots of studies out there that talk about suspension, even suspension as early as preschool in some states. And that is really setting a child up to fail and feeding them into what we call the school to prison pipeline. And so as someone who was involved in education reform, who comes from, my personal story and the stories of people that I know and grew up with, is there was always this disconnect between traditional public schools and communities. And school, for a lot of Black children, did not feel like a welcoming, safe place. And so when dyslexia became part of my world, I started to connect more dots and say, well, you know what? One of the common factors that I'm seeing here is this disconnect with identifying Black children who have dyslexia. And, if you're sitting in a classroom, like I said, you're not learning to read, it's going to morph into something else. And so we see this when we look at our prison population, and we see that there's a disproportionate number of individuals who have characteristics of dyslexia who are incarcerated. And so as I, started to see that, I said, we need some solutions. We need some targeted solutions to support Black families as they navigate this space. And that is how the organization was born.
Right. And really what you're describing and why your organization is needed is because there's clearly a link between race and literacy. And some of the things that came up as you were discussing was that implicit bias, teacher expectations, and attributing delays in learning to some kind of environmental circumstance of that child. Or even there's a lot of research on linking it to poverty,
right,
where I think, embedded in the IDEA is that the difficulty that a child is experiencing with reading can't be attributed to culture or environment.
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so if you blame the culture or the environment for why a child is not reading, then they don't get services. And so that's embedded in that explanation is a problem, because again, you're denying services to a group of children when you erroneously attribute difficulties to their environment, the environment that they come from, even the language experience, where I know a lot of children where English is their second language and who have language delays or have difficulties with reading. For some of those children, the difficulties are attributed to the fact that they did not learn English first. which is problematic.
Exactly, or even dialect, right? So first of all, the African diaspora is just magnificent in terms of the language backgrounds that we bring to it. So, we have our Creoles, and we have our patois, and we have all the different dialects, Southern dialects. And unfortunately, a lot of these dialects are seen as low prestige dialects. And so when a child shows up in a classroom with this, they are judged because of the language that they're using. And so a child showing up in a classroom who's using a different dialect than what is deemed to be, high prestige, who has dyslexia, like you said, it becomes another barrier to identifying them, because you've made judgments about this child based on the language that they're using without looking deeper. And of course, like we know, dyslexia is brain-based, is neurological. So there's nothing about, language, the child's language, home language, that's going to cause dyslexia.
Right. And then when you attribute the delay or the difficulty to a child's background, it almost shifts the blame to the parents. It's like some parents get the message that there's something that they're not doing that is contributing to the difficulties their child is experiencing.
Yes.
And for parents, it's like you're saying, dyslexia is biological, has a neurobiological footprint that has been shown over and over again in the research. But yet so many parents are getting the impression that it's their fault. I've had parents in my office, when I talk to them about their child's dyslexia, say, is it something that I did? Did I, come in too late? Should I have been doing something more? But that's not the case. Is that your experience too, that parents are feeling the blame?
Absolutely. So, and I still sometimes will ask myself questions like, well, should I have done this or should I have done that? And then I remind myself that, there's very little that you're going to do that would cause most of the issues that we see in a classroom. Right. But, you hear questions like, well, did you read to your child? Or what grade, did your child attend preschool, or what preschool did your child attend? Those types of things. And so I think when you understand what dyslexia is and what a lot of the other, sort of language-based reading disorders are, you understand that, even if you're reading to your child every day, like, yes, it's wonderful. You should do that, right? You're going to build vocabulary, and we need vocabulary when we become, readers. You'll build background knowledge, but it's not going to address the issues that are happening because of the neurological differences, right? That's going to come through evidence-based practices like structured literacy. That's going to address like decoding and phonological awareness and all of those types of things. And so, you hear that type of blame, but you'll also hear, blame that comes from, like I said, did they attend the right school? Right. And so along the way, there's a lot of blame that's placed back on the parent, but there's also a lot of blame that's placed on the child in the classroom. And so, well, you're not trying hard enough, or, I have not heard anyone call my child this, fortunately, but you're lazy, these types of things that really blame the child for something that it's not their fault. And sometimes, if you haven't identified it early as a parent, if you're going through it every day and you're hearing the school send you this message, then you start to wonder, like, well, why aren't you trying harder? Like, it becomes it's a shifting of the blame outside of the school building and to the family and to the child. And that does a lot of damage.
Right. And it absolutely does. It impacts the parent-child relationship. If the parent starts to wonder and question, themselves in terms of, is there something my child isn't doing? Is there something that I'm not doing? And then it also, again, delays intervention. When we say, if the child would just work a little harder, spend a little more time reading, that everything would be okay. But what we know about reading is, unlike language acquisition, it needs to be explicitly taught. And so if a child isn't reading after, being exposed to instruction, then we can't delay at least examining a dyslexia screen. And then we have to move really quickly to intervention because we know that there are significant gains that can be made when we really employ an explicit and evidence-based program that targets the underlying difficulties that a child is experiencing that's preventing them from reading. But we have to address it early on so that you don't have a child in 3rd and 4th grade who is now supposed to be reading to learn and is still learning to read.
Right. I mean, yes, all of the studies definitely point to early intervention being the best course, which becomes impossible because in the school building, if you look at what their diagnostic tools are, lots of school buildings don't even have tools that would allow them to identify it. And then the next question is, well, if you do identify it, does the school have staff that's trained to provide intervention?
Mm-hmm. Right. And, it's really heartbreaking because I work with a lot of teachers who work really hard and want their students to do well. And yet we have, 66% of all 3rd graders in the nation are not proficient readers. So what does that tell you when we know that we have good teachers with a heart for teaching kids to learn, but yet we have kids who are still falling behind? And not all of those children have dyslexia. So there's something that seems to be embedded in the education system that is not addressing this gap.
Right. And so I often say it's really a tier 1 issue. What's happening in the general education classroom? What's the curriculum or the approach that's being used? And often you start to see the issues there. Right. So with my son, they were using a mix of things. And so, he was being taught to guess the word or to look at the pictures and those types of things, which we know doesn't work. That's not what he needs. So, there's a lot of change that has to happen at a lot of different levels. And, what we hope to do through the organization is to address it in 3 different areas. And a big part of that is starting with parents because, parents are powerful. They are their child's, greatest advocate, and informing parents so that they know, what they should be looking for when they're, at a parent-teacher conference and they're having, curriculum night and they're talking about the curriculum that they're using. And you're like, oh, wait a second. Let me ask, is this structured literacy, right? So, informing parents. And then, if you have a child who has dyslexia, it's a difficult world to navigate. So we want to provide parents with tools to be able to do that, to be able to navigate that world so that the outcomes are improved. But there's also this call to professionals, right? Because like you said, I believe that I hope that someone enters a classroom or, a related field because they want to do what's best for a child. And so if you look at teacher preparation programs, a lot of them do not address reading instruction. And so you have teachers who enter a classroom who haven't been taught how to teach children to read. And so, connecting with professionals as well, so that we can provide opportunities for them to understand what needs to be implemented in their school. And then just in general, raising awareness about dyslexia, not just about dyslexia, because, right, there are a lot of organizations that are doing that and that are doing a really good job with that, but around dyslexia and race, because it's an equity issue. And we see this when we look at the numbers. So you talked about the numbers in terms of having a national literacy crisis, right? And you said 66%. 66% only 66% in general are proficient, right? But when you start to look at it by race, it's about 18% of Black or African American children are proficient readers when we look at the 4th grade numbers, right? So you're seeing something else that's happening here in addition to dyslexia, which of course just makes it, puts children who have dyslexia at a greater disadvantage. And so, we have to look at our history, right? We have to look at the legacy of public education in the United States for Black families. And we have to think about the legacy of literacy, right? So beginning with anti-literacy laws and understanding that, when, hundreds of years ago, it was illegal for a Black person to learn to read. So what does that mean today? Right? If this is the history in 100 years ago, because there was an understanding then that if someone was literate, they would be free. It opened the doors to freedom, right? And I think it was, I read something, and I often turn to Frederick Douglass because he actually talks a lot about literacy and education. And he said that a Black man who was able to read, his economic value decreased in society during this period of slavery. And so, in that period right after slavery, right after emancipation, we saw this focus on literacy within Black communities because now there was this opportunity here to become literate. And so during slavery, only 10% of Black Americans at the time were literate. But right after slavery, in those years where we had Black literacy societies and we had, literacy programs in Black churches, it jumped to 70%. Right? So from 10% to 70% when we had these targeted programs that really focused on building reading skills. And so it can be done, but then Jim Crow was introduced.
Right.
And then we saw the literacy numbers decrease. And I can follow this path all the way up to present day with policies and legislation that basically, create modern day anti-literacy policies that really target Black communities. And so, as we talk about literacy in Black communities, we have to look at the history in order to really figure out what's our solution? What does this mean for our community? What's our solution? And you mentioned Learning Ally and literacy as a social justice issue. And that is really what it is, right? I hear people talk about it as a social justice issue. They'll say it's the modern day civil rights issue. And it has become that.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, you talk about the importance of educating parents, and they absolutely need to be knowledgeable. But, that's only part of the solution. We have to equip them with resources in order to address the difficulties. But there's, like you were saying, there's a legacy, a history that's contributing to the difficulties that we're seeing. And some of that is related to, poverty and under-resourced schools and under-resourced neighborhoods. And so it's more than just the school building. It's a systemic issue that impacts neighborhoods and the students who are in those neighborhoods. And it can feel like such a significant problem. But again, I think there's an increase in awareness. And I think COVID has actually helped bring light to some of this because there's been such a focus over the last year on these equity issues and social justice issues. And people are kind of taking a closer look underneath the hood to see, well, what else is going on that we need to address? And that's a good thing. But we need a lot more people aware of the difficulties, aware of the problems so that we can work on a solution. Because it's one thing to talk about it, but then the next step is, what do we do? And you talked about educating teachers is one of the things that we need to do. We have to help parents with their self-advocacy skills. So when they are told, your child doesn't qualify for services, and you feel in your gut and your own observations tell you that there's something not quite right, giving them the language and the resources to go a step further and really insist that the school take a look and provide services for their child. And that can be very hard.
Yeah, it can be. And when you think about, special education law and, the IEP, it really is its own language. And, you need to be able to understand that, or even to look at the IEP and say, okay, well, now my child has an IEP, but it doesn't say, structured literacy. It doesn't, say what type of intervention should be used. And so, yeah, there's a lot of information that needs to be shared with parents and support, because this isn't an easy journey, right? It's a very challenging journey to take on, because you end up, you're dealing with whatever's happening in your home, dealing with, okay, well, a diagnosis, and, what does this mean for your child? You're dealing with, okay, well, does my child need to be in a special education program? What does that mean for my child, right? What is that going to look like? Is that really going to help them, or is it going to harm them? And that's something else that we talk to parents about, being in special education, because there was a time where lots of families felt like their children were parked in special education, and it became an excuse for them not to perform or to achieve. But it doesn't have to be that way if you understand special education law and you have the tools to advocate for your child. It becomes a layer of protection. That IEP is a legal document, so you get the right language in there, and you have something to fight with. So adding that to a parent's toolbox is really important, but also support, right? Because one of the things that's really important is to have people that you can turn to that are experiencing or who have experienced something similar, and then just saying, this is what worked for me. It may not work for you, but this worked for me. Or just listening and saying, yep, I understand. I've been there. It's hard. I've cried. Letting them know that the pain, that all of those emotions, validating it, because it recharges you. It recharges you to be part of a community that says, yep, we were there too. Keep going, or you know what? Rest for today. Tomorrow we'll figure it out, and then we'll keep going. That's really important.
And is that part of what the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children does? Is it provides that community for parents who either suspect that their child is struggling with a language-based learning disorder, or has been diagnosed with dyslexia and is trying to figure out what to do, what the next steps are, how to support their child? Can you talk a little bit about what your organization does?
So we are beginning to launch programs. So if you log onto the site now, you can sign up to receive information as we start to unfold and offer the different programs. So I'll speak about the parent part of it. So we call it a family program, because to me and to a lot of families that I speak with, it's a family issue. And very often when we're talking about something like dyslexia, it can be multi-generational. Right? It's brain-based. So you may have a child who has dyslexia, a parent that has dyslexia. So we want to, offer support to multiple generations of grandparents that may have dyslexia, right? Very often undiagnosed. But part of it is the advocacy. So a program that is going to train parents to be advocates and really empowering communities. So, when we train a parent to be an advocate, they can then train another parent to be an advocate. So, we don't want to keep the knowledge. We want to give it to parents so that they can use it and so that they can share it. But then we'll also do things like family literacy programs. So, how do you help your child at home? How do you help your child if you have dyslexia, right? If we're talking about 2 generations of dyslexia. And then we are going to also discuss dyslexia and literacy as a social justice issue as well, because I think that's, it's just a really part of what the experience is for Black Americans. And I think, if you look at our history and the civil rights movement, and you look at Brown versus the Board of Ed, and just the power that came out of our communities around education. And I mention this because very often I'll hear this narrative like, oh, well, Black parents don't care. Our history doesn't tell us that. Mm-hmm. Our history shows a community that understands that education is so important and has fought for it. And so we're going to build off of that power that we have. We already have it. We just need to be able to channel it. We just need to understand the new language, the new policies that are in place. So that we can fight the good fight, right? So that we can make the good trouble that needs to be made.
Right.
So that's what we are going to offer. And that's going to, start to roll out over the next 6 months or so. The actual programs will be in the Northeast, so in New York State and Connecticut, but we'll also offer things, virtually to families, different types of workshops around, IEPs and some family support, so some family mentorship and things like that can, that don't have to be just regional.
Absolutely. And that work that you're describing is so needed because it addresses kind of all the things we've talked about, the need for advocacy, family support, and just understanding what dyslexia is so that when you are seeing something in your child, that you understand it and you look at it through a different lens. And that way you don't fall into this trap of the wait and see approach or the wait to fail approach where someone tells you, like you have stated, it's not something you need to be worried about right now, or he's doing fine where he is, but really, really pushing to get identified if the child does have a language-based learning disorder and then get the appropriate intervention. Because again, the first step is to get identified, but then what do you do once you know, right? We know from the literature, and you've described a lot of the research, that it's not enough to just have that child meet with their teacher for 30 minutes a week. There really has to be a plan that's evidence-based to kind of close that gap. And we need early and reliable screenings. We can't serve students in our schools if we're not identifying why they're struggling. And so there's so many layers to this. And we've been talking about all of those layers. It's comprehensive, but it's not an impossible task. Like you've said, our history has shown that we can do this. Parents are well equipped to become advocates for their child. They just have to have the information that they need and the toolbox in order to do it in an impactful way.
Mm-hmm. And to do it across the child's academic career and then the adult's lifespan, because the other thing that's really important to say is that dyslexia doesn't go away.
It doesn't.
Right? It's going to show up for you across your lifespan. And so, once you've been given the appropriate intervention for reading, then you have to sort of build out these other, compensatory skills or other supports to help you navigate whatever choice it is that you've made in your life, whatever career choice it is, or, whatever it is that you're going to do. And so that's important as well. If you decide to go to college, there's certain accommodations that should be in place for you, right? In the workplace. And this is, there's some other organizations that are working specifically around workplace, but there's certain accommodations that should be there for you as well. And, helping families and helping individuals with dyslexia to understand this as well, right? How to navigate this successfully, because you can do it. You just have to know what are the tools that I need to do it. We have, I talked about the school to prison pipeline, but we have lots of wonderful success stories as well. We have, dyslexia and Black excellence, and that's, part of our awareness as well. There are individuals who have dyslexia, and we have some on our board who, one is an attorney, one is a PhD. These are adults, Black adults with dyslexia who have figured out how to navigate it. And we can learn from their journeys as well. We don't have to hit repeat every time. And this is what we want to do.
That's absolutely true. We don't have to hit repeat. And I think it's important for parents to see those success stories and for their children. Because once children know that they have dyslexia, it's often a big relief because now they understand why they've been struggling. And there's hope because we know that there are things that we can do. And it doesn't have to limit them from being the person that they want to be. And it doesn't define them. And there are a lot of things that they are going to be able to do and be able to accomplish. And they just need the support in order to get there.
Exactly.
So, Resha, you're clearly motivated by your family's journey, and you've got, all the background in terms of your experience in education. And I just think that you sharing your story is going to be so helpful to so many families and to so many parents. You clearly have a passion for education reform, and you see the need to increase awareness about intersectionality of race and literacy. And I'd love to continue this conversation with you and do what I can to support Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children and form more partnerships so that we can get the word out and spread this message and get more support to more kids in our communities.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's definitely going to take a team to do this work. And, I'm happy to have the opportunity to connect with you and support your work. And of course, we'll support each other because our goals, our missions, they overlap, they're aligned. And, you're on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast. We can reach across, right? And reach just so many families.
We can. I think even this year has taught us is that we absolutely can reach across those geographical lines and to have an impact. And I think that it actually has helped us connect with people that we wouldn't have connected with otherwise. Now that we have this platform that we're using to do that.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for being on the podcast. And so parents who want to get in touch with you, who want to know more about Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children, what is the best way for them to reach you?
So you can visit the website. It's dyslexiaallianceforblackchildren.org. And there's a contact button on there. You can also submit your email on there so that you can be informed as to when we start offering workshops. Or you can email. The email address is info@dyslexiaallianceforblackchildren.org. And that is the best way to reach us. And we, like I said, we will follow up and we will make sure that, every family that reaches out to us gets the support that they need or that we're able to direct you to resources.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Resha. Too often, struggling readers are unidentified and they fall behind, and the ramifications can last a lifetime and be devastating. But when reading deficits are identified early, they can be remediated with evidence-based instruction that can transform lives. I have put a number of resources in the show notes, information about dyslexia and about seeking special education services. So be sure to check them out. And also be sure to check out Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children. That link is also in the show notes. Thank you so much, Resha, for coming on the podcast. Everyone, I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.